I just want to start by saying a little bit about science here at Portsmouth Abbey. We, about 17 years ago, made the switch to doing physics as our first science for our high school students. They do physics, then chemistry, then biology for a number of reasons. One of which is that physics is the most basic of the sciences. It's the one I get to teach. It doesn't really depend on any of the other sciences. So I get to deal with questions like, if you were God creating the universe out of nothing, how would you start? First there's stuff, and then you got to put some stuff here and some stuff here. You need space, and if they start moving, you need time. And space and time and stuff is what physics is all about. It doesn't depend on any other sciences. Our students go from that to do chemistry, and after chemistry to biology. And one of the arguments for doing physics first and then biology is that we can do a much more sophisticated biology course for our high school students, and because they've already had chemistry and physics, and it prepares them for the kind of amazing biology that is being taught in colleges by people like Dr. Miller and Father Austriaco. I did a little research on Father Austriaco using such scholarly resources as the internet and YouTube, and found a number of fascinating things. His basic biographical information is in the program. I'll just touch on the outline of a few things. An undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania in bioengineering, PhD in biology from MIT, a fellow at the Ludwig Institute of Cancer Research at University College in London, degrees in sacred theology and divinity at the Pontificate Faculty of the Immaculate Conception at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. He was ordained to the priesthood in 2004. His publications are listed, some of the publications are in the program, so I won't take time to repeat them now. But I'd like to just mention a few things, a few gems that are found on the internet. At Providence, Father Austriaco has worked to arrange for his students to learn, and I quote from one of his articles, not just the data of science, but the art of being scientists. For several years, he's mentored the Dead Yeast Society, which invites students at all levels of original research furthering the study of programmed self-death that has significant anti-tumor defense, is an anti-tumor defense mechanism. Students from freshmen to upperclassmen work in teams and learn to follow the steps that real scientists must go through to publish their results. Among the other biology courses that Father Austriaco teaches, or co-teaches, in a course for freshmen called phage, a new alternative biology lab to collect, isolate, and annotate the DNA of phage viruses. They feed off bacteria, and that whole promise for the treatment of antibiotic-resistant diseases. The video at the PC website gives a glimpse of the enthusiasm of the students as how his students have for the course. I was fascinated by another dimension of Father Austriaco's scholarly work that I discovered in a YouTube video of a lecture he gave at a 2001 Ludwig conference on adult and alternative works of stem cell research. He deals with what I didn't know before, hylomorphic theory, the interaction between matter and form, between body and soul. This past December, he was a featured presenter at the first ever Vatican conference on adult stem cell research. I'll wrap up with two quotes that I couldn't resist. One is from, and forgive me, from readyourprofessor.com. Father Nick is one of the best teachers I have ever had. He was clear, concise, and easily one of the kindest people I have ever met. His class is not easy, but if you attend classes and all are diligent in lectures, you can do great. And one more quote. This is from the syllabus of his course on genetics. His quote: I hope that this course instills into my students the love of learning and the desire for the God who created and evolved all things, DNA included.
Thank you. Thank you for that amazing and wonderful, kind introduction. I've heard so much about Portsmouth because one of my research students is Benjamin Lichtenfels, who's a rising senior. And Ben is one of my research students. He is one of the members of the Dead Bee Society. And this past year was our first year as a Howard Hughes Medical institution, where we are one of 70 schools around the country that is pioneering this phage biology approach for our freshmen. So our freshmen come to PC, and from the very first day, we send them out to the grounds of the college. They collect dirt, and from dirt, they isolate phage. We've actually sequenced our first genome, 59,626 nucleotides, Joe 42, because my student who isolated the phage, his name is James O'Brien. That's the Job part. But the 42 part comes from the fact that it's the 42nd chapter of the book of Job, where Job is rehabilitated. And James had a very difficult freshman year, and he was rehabilitated at the end of the year. And so he always looked at the 42nd chapter as God speaking to him. And so when it was time to name his phage, there it is, Job 42, and it's on the Gen Bank. He submitted it about a month ago. And it's Ben Lichtenfels from Portsmouth, who was the TA for that course. So I've gotten to know him very well. He's now preparing to pray for him because he's studying for his MCATs, and he will take his MCATs in August. And in the providence of God, he'll go off to medical school. So that's kind of like my connection with Portsmouth, and it's been wonderful to come here and to experience the community that Ben just can't stop talking about. So he and his brother Carl are both at PC. Carl just graduated. So for the past 3 years, I've been hearing about the Abbey this, the Abbey that, and just walking around your grounds was a wonderful opportunity. I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, all right, Ben, I saw this and I saw that. And he'll say, did you see this? Did you see that? And you'll go, oh, okay, yeah. And I actually even met one of his classmates. Not here. Anyway, so, is he here? Thank you again for the invitation to come to speak here at the Portsmouth Institute. I'm going to be talking about Adam and Eve. And I'm going to be talking about Adam and Eve from a theological perspective. So, when I do this talk at PC, I taught a course in Science and Religion to our honors colloquium this past semester, and my students will laugh. I actually practiced this talk on them about a month ago. It was great because I got to hear what they had to say. And they would ask me, Father, is this science or is this theology? And I like to begin by saying this is theology. This is a theological enterprise. But theology as the search for, in a sense, a worldview grounded in God. St. Thomas Aquinas will say, doing theology, sacred doctrine, sacra doctrina, is like trying to see the world as God sees the world. And so it's all about God. Everything comes from God. Everything is returning from God. And so my lecture today is really an attempt to try to ask the question, given what God has revealed about himself and about his creation, how can we talk about that in an intelligible way, given all the data that we now have, in this particular case, about the evolution of our species genomic-wise? So, what prompted this was a special issue of the Perspectives of Science and Christian Faith several years ago, where there was an issue on reading Genesis. And here you have several authors, primarily from evangelical Protestant tradition, trying to grapple with the question, how do we deal with Adam and Eve in light of genomics? And so the question that I'd like to address today is, how should Catholic Christians deal with that question? And one of the things I think that I've learned in my reading about contemporary postmodern philosophy is how reason in so many ways is done within a particular tradition. And so I'm going to emphasize at the get-go here that we're working within the Catholic intellectual tradition. I'm going to rely heavily on the thinking of my Dominican brother, St. Thomas Aquinas. Just because, even though he lived 800 years ago, his thought was so metaphysically rigorous that it allows one to address issues that he could not even have foreseen, but in a way that's coherent and intelligible within a perennial philosophical tradition. So we're going to be talking about this. How do we deal with the historicity of Adam and Eve? And I'm going to have, the talk is going to focus on 3 questions. The first is, I'm going to begin by talking about the genomics of the origins of our species. And then I'm going to talk about what the Catholic Church teaches regarding the historicity of Adam and Eve, the origins of our species. And then I'm going to, as Michael Bruce pointed yesterday, propose a program, not necessarily propose an answer, because I would like to suggest that there are many possible answers the kind of questions that I'm going to be dealing with today. And my primary goal is to outline, in a sense, set out a landscape of possibilities. And what's striking is that once these possibilities have been laid out, we can sit there and talk about where exactly we want to be situated. But the thing is, if you know where the boundaries are, you can play soccer. If you're not quite sure where the boundaries are, it's really hard to play a game. And so my goal here is to simply just try to articulate from the Catholic tradition, what would the boundaries be for theological reflection on this question? So I'd like to begin with the science. So I'm going to go back to the first question. What does the genome tell us? Or what does the genomic science tell us about Adam and Eve? What can it tell us about this particular question? And since I'm not going to assume anything, I'm going to begin from the beginning about what a genome is. And so this is a slide I take from one of my courses in introduction to my general biology class. We're going to be talking about the genome. It's all the genetic information of an organism. And in most organisms, the organisms that belong to the class we call eukaryotes, the genome is distributed into 2 particular clusters. You have most of the genome is found in the nucleus. And when I teach general biology, I say, the nucleus is like headquarters for the cell. And so this is kind of like the program that runs the cell. And then you have the mitochondrial genome. The mitochondria is the energy-producing part of the cell. It's the factory that produces ATP. And you have a very small piece of DNA, it's called the mitochondrial genome, and that's going to figure in later in the talk when we talk about mitochondrial Eve. Now, if you take that nuclear genome and you take a look at it, what you're going to see is you're going to see that human genome consists of 23 pairs of chromosomes. And so here you've got nice chromosomal painting of a human genome, and here you have one particular electron micrograph of a single metaphase chromosome. And what you can do is you can take that chromosome, which is localized in the nucleus of the cell, and you basically can stretch it out. And what you discover is that the chromosome is really an extended fragment of DNA. where chromosome 1 is the longest fragment, and 1 going down to 21 and 22 basically is in decreasing length of the chromosome. So we need to talk about DNA. Everyone knows about the double helix. But one thing that you may not realize is that it's made up of 4 kinds of molecules. We call them bases. And for simplicity's sake, we basically assign letters to each one of these bases, A, T, C, G. And what I hope you can see, this is one gene. This is actually the gene that, one of the genes that my students and I are investigating. This is a gene East-Bax inhibitor, which is a homolog for a mammalian oncogene that is involved in kidney cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, and brain cancer. And we know that the gene product for this gene is isolated, is localized in what is called the endoplasmic reticulum, the ER of the cell, which makes proteins. And so in the last 20 years or so, people who study cell death have focused primarily on the mitochondria. Remember, the mitochondria is that part of the cell that makes energy. And we want to look at the ER, the part of the cell that actually generates proteins. And that's really hot right now. People are trying to figure out how exactly the ER is involved in cell death, in cell suicide, because cancer cells do not commit suicide. That's one of the reasons why they can form a tumor. And yeast, this is yeast by the way. Yeast is an amazing organism because we are a yeast killing lab. So my Dominican brothers will say, how many yeast did you murder today? Millions, trillions. We kill them routinely, which is why we're the Dead Yeast Society. Because I tell them that what's great about killing yeast is you can learn a lot about cell death, and if you mess up, you can do the experiment again tomorrow. Because if you were working with something like mice, well, it takes a long time to grow up a new mouse. But yeast, overnight, you've got the yeast cells again, and you can kill them. So this is one of the genes. The yeast genome is only about 12 million bases, 12 megabases, which is nice and compact, nice and small, about 6,000 genes. Great organism to play with. And we play with it because we also brew beer. Because our mutants, because they're unable to commit suicide, they don't die in ethanol. And so we can actually make beer with higher levels of ethanol. Now it's interesting because in my lab, you can make the beer, but you can't taste the beer until your 21st birthday. So they come to my office and their beer is waiting for them. And we have things like Fountain of Youth, Ale Magnus. You know Albertus Magnus is a Dominican saint associated with science, so they call it Ale Magnus. Albertus Magnus. So all of this is great. The genome is great. It's basically 12 million bases. Our genome is 3 billion of these. But the take-home message that I want you to take from this slide is that at the end of the day, a genome can be analogously compared to text, right? Because you can see here, it's basically text in a particular pattern. And the pattern is information. We heard about the genetic code and how we translate that information into the protein machinery that runs the cell. And notice the machine analogy again that Dr. Roos talked about yesterday. That's not really what we're going to focus on today. I want you to think about genomes in the way we would think about texts or manuscripts or phone books. No one uses the phone book anymore. Everyone Googles. But at one point in time, you had the large phone book. Now, so biologists can compare and contrast genomes to determine the relationships among them, and scripture scholars do this, right? So when you're trying to figure out the historicity of, say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what you can do is you can compare the text, you can look for similarities and differences amongst the text, and you can propose hypotheses to solve, for example, the synoptic problem. And so biologists are doing that. You can say, the analogy is think about 10 final exams. I'm a professor, I think exams. 10 final exams with similar answers. What does this tell you about the relationship among them? If I had 10 final exams and 8 of them had identical answers to them, have to sit down and think, right? They have a common origin. We call that cheating. Right? So when you have 10, if you have 10 exams and 8 of them have very similar answers, you would say common origin. Someone copied from someone. And in the same way, you can compare and contrast genomes. So you can take genomes and you can compare and contrast genomes, looking for similarities and differences. And in the same way that we use common sense reasoning to deduce that if you have 10 exams that have similar answers, they have a common origin. One of the things I tell my students is we do the same thing with genomes. You take genomes, and what you can do is, given the similarities, you can deduce they have a common origin. And that's actually one of the postulates for evolutionary theory. Now, when my students go off and I go to the ASBFE meeting, the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology meeting, we went to San Diego this past April, San Diego, very nice, especially April. What's striking is I'll go in with my students to the poster session. There's about 4,000 posters presented. There's about 13,000 scientists from all over the planet who attend this meeting. And what's very striking is I go wearing my clerics. And so my students will always be asked the question, who's he? That's the first thing. Or they'll see an OP after my name on our poster. What's that? And my students will forget how uncommon it is to have a Catholic priest as a biology professor. Because they, oh yeah, that's father. Father. You know, I mean, these people. And then the first thing they ask is, does he believe in evolution? I mean, they will always get that question. They'll say, oh yeah. And it's funny, even in my intro bio class, the very first week I was with students, say, do you believe in evolution? And then they'll say, and the next question that will arise after that is, why? And I say, because of pretty good data. And then they'll talk about the creation and evolution. And this is actually where St. Thomas Aquinas' very robust metaphysics can come in to help us think through these questions. Because so often today, there's an opposition placed between purpose and chance, for example. So the assumption is that if there's chance, you can't have design. And yet St. Thomas Aquinas, in a very beautiful, metaphysically robust way. So for example, question 22, article 4 of the first part of the Summa, we'll talk about how chance, contingency, and purpose are actually not at odds if you think about it from the divine perspective. So if you intervene in an event, necessarily chance is out of the picture, contingency is out of the picture. But one of the things that Thomas will point out is because God is necessary being, and I will put aside Professor Roos's comments on the controversy surrounding necessary being. Because God is necessary being, and because there is what has been called the Christian distinction, that God, being God, is so different. So what's striking when I go to science and religion conferences, the view of God is he's just another force. He's just like a super force. So there's you and me are one force, and then there's God who's a super force, and somehow we've got to put these forces together. And Aquinas will say, no. Because God transcends force. And how God acts is he actually acts through creation. Now, when people think about creation, they think creation in time. They think about creation at some beginning that is now 13.8 billion years ago, the Big Bang that bang, right? When people say, what bang? I say, God bang. So you go all the way down to the back, and you go all the way down, and they say creation. But what's striking if you go to a robust metaphysical scheme in the way that Aquinas will do is that he will talk about how God is creating now. Because creation is primarily giving existence. And one of the things that people posit, and I don't have time to go over right now, is this notion that you and I do not have the ability to give ourselves existence. So existence is a radical gift. And that to understand that is to acknowledge that God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. And that if he forgot you, you would disappear. Because he has to know you in order for you to be. Now, when you have that kind of metaphysical scheme, you can end up saying things like, God made contingent things contingent. And they're contingent precisely because he made it such. Now, clearly that seems very contradictory, but this is where you would have to resort to a robust metaphysics in order to really plunge into that mystery, to figure out what exactly, and there are many distinctions that I would have to make that even intelligible. But I'm going to presuppose that here, that it is not unintelligible or incoherent to say that God creates through evolution, and and he could create through a radically contingent process and still make it such that it comes about in the way that he intended. And again, that's metaphysics, all right? We're not dealing with science per se, which is the philosophy of nature. We're dealing with a philosophy of being. But returning to this, where you're dealing with similar genomes that have a common origin, what you can then deduce are a couple of basic genetic principles. The first one is that the more closely related genomes have a more recent ancestor. If you have 2 exams with 8 questions that are similar versus 2 exams that have 2 questions, you would assume that the copying happened more recently, because the student who copied 8 needed more to copy. You understand? Because again, it's an analogy that we can therefore use. The second is that the differences between the genomes can be used to estimate the historical time since the divergence. So again, it's a corollary to the sense that the more similar, the more recent. And so if you are looking at similarities and differences, you can peg a certain historical time to that. How long has it been since these 2 organisms have had a common ancestor? One of the things that a lot of people will misunderstand about evolutionary theory is that, technically speaking, we did not evolve from the chimps. So a lot of people will say, we evolved from the chimps. No, more properly speaking, biologists will have to say that we and chimps and gorillas have a common ancestor. And that ancestor was not a human being. It also was not a chimp. It was a common ancestor, a primate of some kind. So when we do this, what you can do is in the hominid evolutionary lineage, you can start coming up with these trees. You can think of it as a pedigree tree. So here you are, here's your brother and here's your cousin. So you can think of it as a pedigree tree, and we're dealing with ancestors going up the screen. So humans and chimps, the genomic data suggests that we had a common ancestor 6 million years ago, and then gorillas and the chimps and humans, our common ancestor was 10 million years ago. And what you can do here is that you can keep going down. So if you look at the human tree, you can go down to the common ancestor. Here we are, modern humans. The Neanderthals went extinct 25,000 years ago. Now it's striking on YouTube. There's supposed to be a mammoth somewhere up in Siberia. Now, what's striking, it amazes me how whenever you see YouTube videos of these supposedly extinct species, they tend to be fuzzy. Why is that? I mean, so you see this mammoth crossing a frozen stream in Siberia, and it's just really fuzzy. Now, wouldn't it be great if they could have just turned on their zoom lens and just focused in and just, it's amazing how, I say this, we talk about science, but I think one of the things that's very striking is scientists are human beings too. And one of the things I have to teach my students is there's a culture of science. And that doing science is not necessarily this completely objective thing. We have a story to tell. And so they'll say, well, what story is that? I said, well, what story do you want to say? And they're like, what do you mean? I said, well, here's our data, come up with a story. And I'm like, well, make it the best stories that you can, do not fudge. And I say, when you Photoshop the entire image, not some portion of the image. But you can come up with a story. And how you tell the story influences how people see your data. And so the same thing with this mammoth picture, right? So you see this mammoth, it's a little fuzzy. People start describing it in particular ways, and you're beginning to see a woolly mammoth with all its large tusks. Now, the Neanderthals, of course, they're supposed Yetis and all sorts of things. Again, they're all fuzzy pictures. with large footprints in the sand. But I think Dr. Miller would agree, all our data suggests they went extinct about 25,000 years ago. But as I will mention later, we have some of their genes. And that's really about if you basically are descended from populations of humans from outside Africa, the end of the day, about 4% of your genome is made up of Neanderthal genes. And there's a very interesting discussion as to whether or not the genes that we inherited from the Neanderthals are genes involved in the immune response. So the reason why we kept them is because they make us more robust. They keep us basically healthier than if we didn't have them. So you have the Neanderthals, and then there's this other archaic human, archaic hominins, the Denisovans. We'll talk about them in a minute. If you go back to the archaic humans about 65,000 years ago, this is our immediate evolutionary lineage. There's me, a bunch of you are here, and some of you may be elsewhere. All right, so you've got these modern humans, and we have this tree. So you see, we can come up with this incredibly detailed tree. Couple things though, you notice there is a common origin. So I hope that you realize that one of the first things that we're dealing with is that there's a common origin. We have a common ancestor. So how do you figure this out? How do we do this? Well, what you can do is you can take human beings today and you can sequence their genomes, and then you can do a compare and contrast. So you can take individuals living in sub-Saharan Africa. You can take people. Did you just die? Okay. You can take me and my family. There's a couple of you. And Melanesians. And what we can then do is we can then ask, what is the relationship amongst all these genomes? And you can come up with this type of scenario. Bob's checking out something. The sound is off, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, I think the battery has died. I feel like I'm back in the classroom. Sometimes the computer will just turn off in the middle of your lecture, and then the computer screen goes on, and you're like, I guess I have to shut up for a while. The humans, the gremlins. Is it back on? Okay. So what you can do then is you can actually take genomes of extant humans right down here, and you can come up with genetic markers. So for example, each of these dots represents a genetic marker. And I'm not going to talk about what these genetic markers are. They're single nucleotide polymorphisms. There's slight changes in the sequence of the DNA. But we can trace, in a very real way, we can trace the historicity of the tree all the way back to a common ancestor. And so what we have is this is the current view about our species. Our species is, the data suggests that our species evolves in Eastern Africa, and there's a migration out of Africa about 50 to 70,000 years ago. And one branch basically heads out to Australia. Another branch goes through Asia, over the Bering Straits, and down into North and South America. Now there's a debate here over the Clovis, whether or not, so the current account is that 13,000 years ago or so, you have what is called the Clovis culture, but there seems to be where they migrated and basically migrated through the central parts of North America to the continent. But I think just reading one of the most recent issues of Nature, where they have wonderful reviews on this topic, I think there's data suggesting now that there were humans predating Clovis. There's actually a site way down here where you're dealing with, as I said, 15,000 to 13,000 years ago. So this is the standard model. We all have a common ancestry in East Africa. So you have this consensus. Modern humans, common origin, about 120,000 years ago. They dispersed from Africa about 65,000 years ago. And this is the issue of Nature. If you want a really recent and robust review for, in a sense, more popular audience, this is the issue to go to. Now, just to give you a sense of what we can do, this is my family's genetic history. So I was sitting in a conference like this next to this very interesting young lady who turned out to be working for the Human Genographic Project, which is an attempt associated with the National Geographic magazine to categorize all the human genomes in the world. And so she said, would you like to have a kit sent to you? I said, that's pretty cool. So I sent the kit, and then I scraped my mouth, sent the DNA in. And so this is basically a sense of that. So we look at the Y chromosome, my Y chromosome, and what's striking, of course, with Y chromosomes is that they're inherited only from their father, and only males have them. When I ask my students, what is the most, the definitive phenotype associated with the Y chromosome, it's being a guy. Right? That's being a guy is what defines the Y chromosome, the SRY gene in particular. But at the end of the day, what you can do is you've got these markers. Remember I told you there are DNA markers, and you can trace the markers. Well, these are some of the DNA markers that are found on the Y chromosome. And this is my genetic background. So if you look at my Y chromosome, what you can see is that these are the markers that I have. And at the end of the day, each of these markers can be associated with a particular geographical region from where the marker arose. And so you can actually see how your ancestors migrated. And so it ends here about up here in northern China. People say, well, you're a Filipino. How does that work? Well, if you read Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, what you're going to see is that about 4,000, 5,000 years ago, you have a migration from South China to populate the southern part of the Pacific. And the Filipino people we can trace our origins to about 3000 BC from that migration. That was a cultural migration. And the Human Genographic Project has not yet gone down to the ability to discern within this population. So that they need more data to figure out this sort of thing genetically. We know it culturally, but we don't know it genetically. Now, what about mitochondrial Eve? So you've heard about mitochondrial Eve, I'm sure. We inherit, so in the same way that Y chromosomes are inherited from your dad, mitochondrial genomes are inherited from your mom. And so what about mitochondrial Eve, right? We inherited just from our moms. What's striking is that if you compare all our human mitochondria, it suggests that we are descended from a single female living on 200,000, 250,000 years ago. But I need to tell you, there's a lot of people say, oh, this must be Eve. She's, what's striking, of course, is she was not the only woman at that time. This is really what a lot of people have difficulties thinking about. We are descended, if you look at the mitochondrial DNA, we are descended from a single female. This does not mean she was the only female living at the time. And I need to explain this, because people will say, how do you get that? And to explain that, what you have to say is, mitochondrial DNA suggests that we're descended from a single female. But to explain nuclear genome diversity, we know she was not the only woman alive. Now let me explain what that means. So here are beagles, right? So you go, okay, here's daddy beagle and mommy beagle, and there are 3 beagles. So there's a pedigree right there. Now, I say, does this dog pedigree make sense? Yes, it does, hopefully. But if I change this and I have a Dalmatian here and I go, does this make sense? You're like, no. It doesn't make sense because to explain Dalmatian, the presence of this Dalmatian, you can't have just 2 beagles. You've got to have this. Because in order to explain what's going on here, certain things have to be true about what happened in the past. So in my epistemology class, I ask the students, what is the surest, what is the best evidence you have for the fact that your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather lived? Now it's striking, you'll start off this conversation and say, all right, George Washington. How do you know he was the first president of the United States? That's good. Well, he's on the dollar bill. I'm sure that student did not go to Portsmouth. Nonetheless, one of the things that I hope that you see is that the very best evidence that your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather lived, the best is you, right? You are the best. So in many ways, when we look at what we have today, we can figure out something about what happened a long time ago. And the question we want is, so how many mating pairs 65,000 years ago would explain the genetic diversity of the 7 billion people today? See, that's really how a biologist would understand this question. Given what we have out there as of today, how many would you have to posit to be in the original population? And 1,000 to 2,000 mating pairs, or 3,000. It varies. Small geographic area, East Africa, 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. This is the standard consensus. It's always disputed. I mean, this is the thing in science is everything is always disputed. You know, there's a sense that we make our names and our careers disputing other people. And so it's not surprising that there's always a dispute. So when people point out there's a dispute about evolutionary theory, you should say, well, there's a dispute about everything in science. It takes a long time for scientists to come to a real consensus that we're studying something that we think is really true. Now, one of the things that this is from a paper published in 2004. I want you to think about this, right? How far back in time must we go to find an individual who was the ancestor of all present-day human beings? It's an interesting question. And this group from MIT basically set up models. They did genetic modeling to ask the question, how far back do you have to go? Now, I want you to understand this question. Here I am, and Brother Bonaventure is over there. And if we trace our lineage back, eventually one of his ancestors is also going to be one of my ancestors. It's just going to be, because there's a limited number of people who ever lived. Demographers say 110 or so billion people have ever lived completely on the planet. All right, so if you do the calculation, all you have to do is go back 2,300 years ago, Aristotle. At the time of Aristotle, what will happen is you can find someone in Aristotle's time who is a direct ancestor to every human being who ever lived. Now I need to say this, to put the whole mitochondrial Eve discussion in perspective, right? Now, what's striking is identical ancestor. If you go back 5,000 years ago, according to this model, and of course it's a model limited by the presuppositions that went into the model. If you go back to 5,000 years ago, back here, what you will find is that every person living 5,000 years ago, so this would be the Egyptians, the time of the pyramids, every human being there who lived at that point is either an ancestor to everyone who lives today, or is not an ancestor to any. There is no intermediate. So there's not this sense that you can have someone who is just an ancestor to the people who lived in Greece. So it's not intuitive, right? And you have to look up this paper, but the model, it's a fascinating proposal based on modeling and generation time, that if you go back 5,000 years, there's only two kinds of people out there. It's either your great-great-grand ancestor or someone who's totally unrelated to anyone. But that's the time of the Egyptians. That's the time. So Pharaoh could have been an ancestor to everyone here. And given that he probably had numerous concubines, it is likely that compared to someone who was a slave, it is more likely than not that he would have been, in fact, a direct answer of all of us here in this room. Think about that. Think about what that means. And theologically, it's interesting because it says something about the nature of the church. So if I had to switch to theology and ecclesiology, I think you can do a lot of thinking about this. Sure. It's volume 431 of Nature, September 30th, 2004. Now, I'm going to bring this up. I don't know if you know about this. This is the Toba super eruption. 74,000 years ago. Toba is currently a nice, wonderful volcanic lake in Indonesia, but it's a super volcano. And what that means is, here you've got Mount St. Helens, 1980. That is 1. So if you designate volcanic eruption in Mount St. Helens as a 1, the Toba supervolcano was 2,800 times more powerful. And what's striking is the geologists are suggesting that the data suggests that it led to large-scale deforestation of India with an instant ice age where temperatures dropped by as much as 28 degrees Fahrenheit, lasting 1,800 years. It got cold really, really fast. Now, you can imagine if you were a hominin population, a human population about this time, what would that happen to you? You can't go into the heated room, right? It's going to drop for 1,800 years. Just keep that in mind because I'm going to build on that. All right, third scientific consensus. These archaic hominins, Neanderthals and Denisovans, they mated with our human ancestors. And we can do this because we can compare. They've actually isolated the DNA from Neanderthals. You can get their DNA from fossils. You can sequence them. You can compare and contrast, just like those 2 exams. And you can tell that there was interbreeding between these different humans. Now, it's striking because then I'll ask someone like Dr. Miller, so do we belong to the same species then? You know, are Neanderthals and modern humans the same species? The species question raises its head, and I think it's a hard question to address. At the same time, we can say you can't even know the essence of a fly. And in many ways, that answer is an answer to the species question that biologists deal with. It's hard to figure out what the essence of a human being is. And you need, in order to distinguish between this thing and that thing, one of the things you need to know is you have to first be able to say what this is, and then identify what's called a specific difference that will distinguish this from that. And if you're having enough difficulties figuring out what you are, it's going to be very hard to distinguish the difference between you and me and versus other. All right, and then there's disputed scientific claim. Basically, there's the idea that anatomically modern humans appear 100,000 years ago, but there is this observation that behaviorally modern humans only appear about 50,000 years ago. And the current explanation is a genetic mutation that facilitates the acquisition of language. Not quite clear, because this is basically something in the area of cognitive sciences, and we're not quite sure how to do that. All right, the Catholic Church. I'm going to accelerate here because in many ways the theology is a lot easier to go through than the biology, only because the biology for most of you, this would be rather new. So what does the Catholic Church teach about the history of Adam and Eve? When I talk about this, a lot of people will go back to Humani Generis. So Pope Pius XII, we heard about Pope Pius XII already. If you go to Humani Generis, which is an encyclical, 62 years ago, 1950, to paragraph 37, he will say this: "For the faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who do not take their origin, the natural generation from him as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents." So this is considered by some to be a definitive statement on the church that polygenism, in other words, the theological hypothesis theory, that there were more than 2 original human beings has been ruled out. Well, what's striking is you see the next reason. You ask, why? Why can't this be held? Because for Pius, it is no way apparent how such an opinion can be reconciled with that which the sources of revealed truth and the documents of the teaching authority of the church proposed with regard to original sin. Now, Professor Bruce yesterday was talking about how science seeks coherence. I think all human beings seek coherence. I'm a priest. I hear that all the time. When you don't have coherence, problems arise. But theology also tries to seek coherence. And so one of the tasks of a theologian is to try to fit all the pieces together. That's why it's harder to do theology as the church progresses, because there's a lot more pieces in the puzzle to to put together. It's easy to come up with a new puzzle. It's hard to work with the pieces that have been given to you in divine providence. So what happens now is, one of the things you have to think about is what was the biology in 1950? So in 1950, you have the predominant understanding, what is called a multi-regional theory, where human beings evolved independently in independent areas from a common ancestor that was not yet human. And from a Catholic perspective, that causes problems with regards to the very nature of our species. Because one of the things theologically, and I'm going to go into theology here, is if Christ redeemed our human nature, then the human nature that he redeemed has to be the human nature that all of us share. And there's an enormous amount of theological reflection on that Christocentric anthropology. And in 1950, given this, you would have to say that whatever happened in 1950, there was not a neat, clear sense of how we could unify human nature if there were radically different origins for human beings living in China versus human beings living in Brazil. Now, I'm suggesting to you today that the genetic evidence suggests that this is actually a much clearer picture. The out of Africa theory. It's not all the gene. I mean, a lot of people in the audience who are not geneticists will tend to look at this as a gene-centric view. There's also a lot of archaeological views that supports this, but I think the genetics is just one more piece of the puzzle that puts this together. So now moving on to the Holy Father, Blessed John Paul II. This is now in 1996, his message to the Pontifical Academy. What you see here is in his discussion of evolution is that he first asserts that there's no conflict between evolution and the doctrine of the faith. Now, again, in the Catholic audience, I always point it out. From within the Catholic tradition, there does not have to be a conflict between evolution and Christianity. And this is a very controversial statement. He said some new findings lead us toward the recognition that evolution is more than a hypothesis. And what's striking is a lot of my students don't understand what a hypothesis means, what a theory means, how this works. And if I say, how many of you have been to Australia? All right. For those of you who have not been to Australia, is it there? Now, is that a hypothesis, a theory, or a fact?
Fact.
Why? Why? Why is it a fact? Have you seen it? I'm just raising that question to highlight that it's not immediately obvious why that is a fact, while evolution is a hypothesis. A lot of writing and thinking has gone into that. I just want to point out to you it is not a straightforward thing. And the essential point, the origin of the human body comes from living matter. If the origin of the human body comes from living matter, the spiritual soul is created directly by God. This is not just purely a theological claim. There's actually a philosophical claim associated with that. And that spirit, matter cannot generate spirit. But that's a different topic. All right, moving on to 2004. This is the International Theological Commission, chaired by Ben Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. You notice we're now moving in paragraph 63. There's a humanoid population of common genetic lineage. So the church is actually open now to this understanding. And then here, number 70 of the same document, whether as individuals in population. So the church is actually open. The question is how exactly you're going to think through that. That's something that we, as Christians, have to grapple with. We grapple with science, we grapple with theology. So finally, in the last couple of slides, how can one actually do it? Like I said, this is not an answer, it's a proposal, and it's just to stimulate conversation. What you do is, why even bother? So I have friends at MIT, evangelicals who are pretty much engineers, and they'll say they don't believe in evolution. And we have very interesting conversations because they'll say, what about fossils? Oh, the devil put it there. I said, why did the devil put it there? The devil put it there to test your faith. I said, but you know, if the devil can mess around with fossils, how can he not mess around with my experiments? Oh, he could. The difficulty is, what happens is it begins to undermine the scientific enterprise itself. Because once you have the evil one, now the evil one is there. I'm a priest, you know. I encounter, and this is part of like, the evil one is there, and he can do it. Some of the stuff he can do, he's a really smart guy, that one. I mean, and he can do things that transcend ordinary human intelligence. He's really smart, he's an angel. And because he can do things that in many ways, I mean, you can talk about Machiavelli. I mean, this is like angelic Machiavelli. And he can do really, really crazy things. But he doesn't mess around with experiments. We have to state that. Otherwise, the entire scientific enterprise goes out the door. And it would be very hard for him to put fossils in the fossil record, especially in a very coherent way. I mean, this is the thing, right? He doesn't just have, it's not just that he put it in, but he put it in a way that using the reason that God gave you, you would be misled. So it leads to a certain account of reason. It presupposes a certain account of reason. It presupposes a certain account of God that will allow this to happen. And of course, theology is always about God. So I'm going down here to faith and reason. This is an encyclical written by John Paul II. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And this, in many ways, could be a mantra for the Dominican order. This is what my brother Bonaventure, this is what we do. Right? Faith and reason. In the tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas, we struggle through the dark night of apparent contradiction to try to discern truth with the help of grace. And that's basically why we do this. Because both lead to God. Because both faith and reason come from God. Now, so there cannot be a conflict between authentic theology and authentic science. Now, what about Holy Scripture? And Professor Roos brought this up yesterday. How is a Catholic Christian going to come to terms with Genesis? Now, so I'm going to cite the Catechism of the Catholic Church, several paragraphs. Now, it's interesting. The biblical account expresses this reality in symbolical languages. There is the symbolism of biblical language. The account of the fall in Genesis 3 uses figurative language. So already immediately, the Catholic tradition affirms that we have to take the Word of God on its own terms. You see? And now you have to provide an account for how God could work through the Holy Scriptures in that way. But that, again, that's primary and secondary causality. But we can say it's figurative. We can say it's symbolic. The question is, where does the symbol end? And where does the reality begin? And this, of course, is the constant tension in the science and religion discussion. So I need to address, I talked a lot about science. Are they trustworthy? You know, a lot of people say, well, and this is what I say to my students. As evidence mounts in favor of a hypothesis, and this is important, especially convergent data from independent laboratories using different techniques and methods, then it becomes increasingly unlikely that rival hypotheses are true. And the data that I talked to you about today come from many, many labs using many, many approaches. And the emerging picture, it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be arguments, there's going to be disputes, but I think we've got a pretty good look of what the boundaries are going to be. It's going to be something like the picture that I gave you. So then how can we reconcile these findings with theological doctrines? Is you have to ask, which theological doctrines do you have to reconcile with? And I go back to reminding you that this has to deal with original sin. So if you're talking about Adam and Eve, it comes to original sin. So we have to ask very quickly, what does original sin entail? And Professor Roos was talking about this. So again, I'm going to cite from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So this is how the Catholic tradition understands original sin. So by his sin, Adam as the first man lost the original holiness and justice he had received from God, not only for himself, but for all human beings. And this discussion, of course, is complex. What does it mean to say, what was Adam like before the fall? And this notion of original justice with the preternatural gifts that he had been given. That's another lecture. But there's an idea that he was given gifts that made him special. He didn't die, for example. That's just one, right? He was supposed to be immortal. And those gifts were supposed to be given to his descendants. But when he turned his back against the gift giver, he necessarily turned his back against the gifts. And so when he returned the gifts, when he spurned the gifts and he returned the gifts to the Creator who had given them to him, he did not have the gifts to give them on to his descendants, which is why we have. I mean, a very simplistic way, that's kind of like a theological understanding to that. So, Adam and Eve transmitted to their descendants, to us, the human nature wounded by their first sin and deprived of original holiness and justice. This deprivation is called original sin. Original sin is an absence. We should have had something. And it's striking, as a priest, and as a priest who's worked as a hospital chaplain at a hospital, I spent 6 months in New York Cornell Presbyterian, at the prayers in the Upper East Side. And one of the things I'm there to help people to die. And one of the things that people say is that there's something it's unfair that I'm going to die. And I say, you're right. Because you were not supposed to die. There's something visceral about that somehow dying is unfair. And the Christian tradition, the Gospels provide an explanation for that human intuition. I'm going to put that intuition, that there's an injustice associated with that. Human nature is weakened by in its power, subject to ignorance, suffering, and the domination of death, and inclined to sin. That's why we hate. This is why we hate. The question, why we hate? This is why we hate. Now, hate, it's everywhere. And the Christian will say, if not by grace, there is hate. And then one of the things I need to conclude is that original sin is transmitted by human nature, by propagation, not by imitation. So it's not that you learned sin. It's not that you were growing up from the Catholic perspective. It's not that you were born and your parents taught you to be sinful. There's something just deeply flawed about human beings. And I think evolutionary theory provides an explanation for why that could have been the case and why God necessarily had to give preternatural gifts to sustain us in this state of original justice. But then that's another situation. So we have to reconcile the science with the church's teachings. And so what I'm going to do, this is the last slide, is basically a possible scenario, right? So what kind of a story? We're a storytelling people. So hominins, I'm going to propose this story, right? Hominins evolved into archaic humans that are anatomically modern about 150,000 to 100,000 years ago in Africa. After a single moment in time, after the Toba super eruption, it's interesting the dates. There's pre-Toba and post-Toba out of Africa theories. God infused a small population of these hominids with a spiritual soul after they had evolved matter that was apt for that soul. This is where the hylomorphic theory of Aristotle and Aquinas is coming into play. They become rational animals, and I say the great leap forward in the state of original justice. Adam is a member, possibly the tribe leader of this population. He and his wife disobeyed the Lord in some way, leading the rest of the tribe to do the same. Their descendants would migrate and eventually colonize the planet. And of course, in time, in God's time, Jesus Christ comes into the world. Acknowledgements. This is my science and religion class. We debated this all semester. So this was like the ongoing conversation that my students and I had this past semester on Adam and Eve. Because I told them that if they wanted to see how theology is done, one of the things we could do is do theology. So we did the science part, we did the religion part, and we worked to try to bring it together. So this is my science and religion class. This is also Father Tyson Marie Cordell from St. Pius V Parish. He's a newly ordained priest last year, and when he entered the order, when he was a student brother, at the very beginning, he didn't understand evolution. And so we talked about evolution for 7 years. And we just talked about evolution. And this series of slides basically is bearing the fruit of that extensive conversation that I have with my brother, Hyacinth Marie, and my Dominican brothers who have just argued with me to no depth about this. When I entered the order, I was a materialist, an empiricist. MIT does that to you. And I didn't understand why philosophy was even something that I should do. And it was my brothers who, in charity and in great patience, were able to show me that in addition to the sensible, the intelligible is also a legitimate marker for truth. And that was a conversion, an intellectual conversion to try to bring all of those together. This is the Dead Bee Society. This is Benjamin Lincolnfels from Portsmouth Abbey. So this is my laboratory. And one of the great things about Providence College is since all of them have had SIV, like we can sit there and run the polyacrylamide gel and discuss the brothers Karamazov at the same time. And so discussing science and religion in the research lab is something we do like all the time, right? And so, and I'm a biologist, so I'm going to end with funding. So we can't do anything. My laboratory is funded. Basically, we have grants from PC, from the NSF, the NIGMS, and the Rhode Island Institute program. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't lose you. I was trying very hard in like an hour to just cram a semester of thinking. Any questions? Yes, sir. Race. Race. It's interesting. So we have this. So I also teach a class in genes and gender at Providence College, and so we have questions about gender and race. Now, I tend to think about it in terms of ethnic populations, right? Are there genetic differences between individuals who evolved in the tropics vis-a-vis individuals who evolved in the temperate regions? Yes. In fact, there's actually some suggestion that in a very real way, there are medications that would be much more helpful for an individual of an ethnic background, one particular ethnic background versus another, because it is more likely than not genes that they inherited from their parents and from their ethnic population predispose them for the mode of action of a particular drug. That's what I said. Now, how else do you read into that? That's a different question, right? So people will say, is race real? And I say, well, it's as real as you say being white or black or brown or blue or green is real. But we have a common, this is where I think we have a genome that has a common origin. There are differences, right? But in many ways, the differences amongst the populations, there are also differences between the populations. And if you're going to say that the differences between the populations are not socially significant, then you have to come up with a reason for why the genetic differences between populations is different. And that's where I'm going to stop. I'm going to just say that I think it's very clear that, as you can see, when we recreate this human pedigree, there are individuals of specific ethnic background that will cluster together into particular populations. It's not associated with country, it's associated pretty much where your ancestors evolved. Anything more than that, I think, goes outside the realm of science.
Brown-eyed people before 10,000 years ago.
I have no idea. It's interesting that Neanderthals were supposed to have been redhead because we can actually sequence the melanocortin receptor from. So one of the things is you've got mutations. The melanocortin receptor is the receptor that's individual for pigmentation in our species, not only in our species but in zebrafish as well. Again, it's some very striking things like zebrafish, you know, those fish that are striped. Well, there was a wonderful cover on the journal Nature, I think, where you have a white and a black man right next to two fish. Well, it's the standard generic wild type black and white zebrafish, and there's this golden hue. And it turns out that the genes, the genetic differences between those two fish are also the explanation for the differences in our pigmentation. So we actually know from sequencing the genes, the melanocortin receptor for Neanderthals, that at least one of them was a redhead. Yes, sir.
Where in the slide, your hypothesis slide, where would that be, the so-called Cambrian explosion?
Well, I mean, this is way, I mean, 65, what is that, how many million years ago?
To use John Hutt's analogy of that book with all the pages, what Father Nick has been talking about is the last clause in the last sentence, and the Cambrian explosion is in the next last column.
We're not even, we're talking thousands. The Cambrian explosion is millions. Yes, sir. Yes, brother.
You sound like you're an insider. Can you tell us how soon we'll be able to clone Neanderthal?
How soon to clone a Neanderthal?
Why would you want to do that?
I was just going to say, sometimes you meet them in New York. But this is from my students from New Jersey. I think one of the things, so now I'm going to move to the bioethics side. It's very clear, for reasons that are not self-evident to us, that cloning in primates is much less efficient than the cloning in other species. There is a laboratory at the University of Oregon, in Portland, that was only in the last year able to clone an macaque. So you're dealing with the cloning of a primate. And they actually had to use incredibly specialized technology in order to get that cloning to stick. So, and it was incredibly inefficient. And remember, Dolly, the sheep, was already very, very inefficient. 1 in 250. Now, what's striking about that is the question is why you would want to do this. So when I was involved in what has been called stem cell wars, this was pre-2007. The primary reason given for the cloning of human beings is actually not to clone a human being per se, but to isolate stem cells from clones of patients so that those stem cells would not be immunologically rejected when they were transplanted back. Today, with the advent of induced pluripotent stem cells, Yamanaka's groundbreaking work, which he will receive a Nobel Prize for one of these days, is expected. We really don't need to clone. Now, and I'm sure Dr. Miller and those the scientists here, one of the difficulties is like when I go to MIT. So I encountered the Lord at MIT. So I'm a priest today because at MIT I met the business. So a lot of people say, why did you go to MIT? I was sent to MIT to meet. And so when I return to MIT, it's always very striking because I go back as a priest. They always go, what happened? It's very hard for them to imagine that I could be a priest and I could be a So when we talk about these questions, one of the things that scientists bristle at is the notion that non-scientists could regulate or put limits to their work. So some of, you're dealing with human nature, the fall of human nature. The idea that someone could tell you shouldn't do that. It's very hard for everyone, but I think especially a scientific culture that rightfully so is very protective of the freedom to explore things that you don't know where it will lead, right? But then I tell people that, but we have to acknowledge that there have to be certain boundaries in which we work, especially if most of our funding comes from our fellow citizens. They should have a say to what we do, and this is through the political process. Now, it has to be a political process that is scientifically informed, and is not just driven by ideology. And I think part of what, hopefully, Dr. Miller, what I like to do is just to go out and to talk about science in a way that's amenable to the people of God. And when I talk to my friends from biology, and they'll say, why is it that nearly 50% of our fellow citizens are creationists? And I say, you have to understand this, right? If you, as someone who's not really gone to college, or you who has gone to college but never really took a biology class, if you're being asked to choose between evolution and your grandma, which one will you choose? And your grandma has told you about the Bible. Your grandma has told you about Adam. Your grandma has told you about God. And the problem with the new atheist movement is that evolutionary theory is associated with atheism in a way that it does not necessarily have to be. But many, many people associate, they think that if you are an evolutionary biologist, you must be an atheist. And so when they're choosing between grandma and what grandma has given me, and evolutionary biology, and this non-grandma, Dawkins, it becomes very easy for them to choose grandma. And this is where I think, especially the Catholic Church has, in a sense, an opportunity to speak about faith and reason that acknowledges that God works in the most mysterious ways, but gives us the dignity of being authentic and true causes, as my brother Aquinas would. And that we can actually learn stuff, and we can actually do stuff, and he wanted us to learn and do stuff. And that's why he made us in his image and likeness. And trying to put that all together, first of all, it's fun. It's fun. But it's also something that we need to do as human beings. Yes?
You said they will choose grandma. I live in Florida, and I live with a lot of grandmas. They think grandmas think outside of atheists, not evolutionary atheists. Do you believe, I work with faith formations, and I'm trying to help grandmas understand how to talk with their children and how to understand faith and reason. We used to be, they said, well, that's still and so forth. But it's a very important thing for adults to know, not just children.
Well, what's striking is if you go to Europe, this is really, evolutionary creation is not really. One of the things that Catholics have to understand is that the United States is really a Protestant nation. And even Catholics in this country have been shaped by a Protestant ethos. So many Catholics here view the creation and evolution debate primarily from a Protestant lens. So when I go over to Rome and have talk, they're like, why is it such a big problem? I mean, it doesn't seem to be a big problem. You can see how there's an effort to try, but here it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge to try to talk about. And what ends up happening is a lot of people compartmentalize it. So on Sunday, I go to church and I'm a creationist. And then when I go out into the world, I'm an evolutionist. And there's not the sense of trying to put it together. And I think that's part of the challenge. And my brothers and I, one of the things we're trying to do is to try to, our charism given to St. Dominic 100 years ago was to work and to think. We're geeks for God. And so as geeks for God, what we try to do is to think, to write, to preach for the salvation of souls. And one of the things that we're working on is this. How do you get this kind of talk and thinking into the pews? I mean, like we have a project out there that where we're out there. One of the things is we want us to write parish bulletins, like a series of 52 parish bulletins on science and religion, back to front. It can't be too long. We live in a YouTube world, and that you just put on the internet and parishes can download. Now, this is the thing. It takes intellectual work. Not just for us to do this, but for you to think about it. I mean, talking about God as a necessary being is not a self-evident thing. And how do you describe that to someone who hasn't been to CCD for 20 years? Someone who really has not thought about this, who's heard this and that from YouTube, from some mainstream media outlets, and there's all this hodgepodge of ideas, but there's no way to bring it together. And how do you reach them? I mean, that's part of like what we're trying to do. Now, we have meetings like this, but we want the pew, right? I mean, how do you do that? Yes, Abby.
I realized that you were not giving definitive answers and that the scenario that was up on your last screen was just a scenario. But I want to make sure I understood you properly. Were you saying that in your understanding of the Catholic doctrine, that despite the fact that for hundreds of thousands or millions of years before our species, every living being expired after a finite period of time, nevertheless, at the beginning of Homo sapiens sapiens, there would have been no bodily death apart from sin?
So I'm going to go back to St. Thomas. Question 96, Article 3. St. Thomas will talk about, was there death prior to the fall? It's a very fascinating question. Because when I talk to my evangelical friends, they think that lions are vegetarian prior to the fall. And there's an understanding that after the fall, that's when death entered the world. Not necessarily just human death, but death. And St. Thomas will point out, he says that to claim that the fall converted lions from being vegetarian into carnivores is to attribute too much power to sin. Because in doing that, you claim that sin changes nature. And Thomas is not willing to concede that sin is powerful enough to change nature. So, and I have no time to go into the details, but in a Thomistic account, what Thomas will say is that animals killed prior to the fall. Eagles were eagles, and lions were lions, and banana trees were banana trees. But they did it in an ordered way. And of course, we can talk about what that means, about what in the ordered way is all about. So there was death before the fall. Now, Thomas, so I will now move to the point of what happens when you have commonization. Well, I mean, building on the teaching of Aquinas, I would say, well, when human beings are created, they're given these preternatural gifts. And these preternatural gifts basically provides order into order that in such a way that the spirit properly is the master of the body. And really, original sin is a disordering of the proper relationship where the lower passions are ordered to the higher passion, and then God, the sensitive appetite is ordered to the rational appetite, and then man is ordered to God, etc. And so what ends up happening is there is a loss of those preternatural gifts. And disorder enters not only the individual human being, but it then enters creation itself. And once it enters creation itself, you have things that, I mean, lions still stay lions and eagles stay eagles, but, and this is where I have not thought about this any further, what I'm saying, they do it in a way that is not ordered. And now this requires an enormous exposition of what order means, both theologically, philosophically, and then biologically. You have to engage in that. What is that?
Father, excuse me for a second. We can keep going, but I just want those who have got to make travel connections to feel free to go.
Thank you very much.
I also quickly want to thank all of our speakers for their wonderful contributions, our sponsors, and most particularly all of our conference staff, most especially Fran Cook and Cindy Waterman, who make our Father Nick, if you'd like to take more questions, we can keep going.
Any other questions? Oh, wow. Let me put this back on. Sorry. Yes, sir. Hi.
You mentioned some one of your papers, and I may be partial on what you said, but
describing evolution as the narrative of stochastic processes characterized by serendipity, which I thought was a really beautiful way to put it. And it makes me wonder, as a theologian, do you think there is an argument from serendipity?
Okay. So people, I will rephrase the question this way. So my students will ask me in the class, why did God choose to create through evolution? Why didn't he just create in the way that when people talk about creation, they think about creation? Okay, boom, there's a dog, boom. And again, I'm going to go back towards Aquinas. Because again, this metaphysics is wonderful. So if you go to Aquinas, and this time I think it's question 103, Article 6. And what he does there is he deals with providence and he deals with governance. And what he asks is this question, right? He will argue this, that God, it is fitting. Now, I'm using, so there are ways you can argue theologically for fittingness. In other words, God being God, it would be cool that he did it this way. That's how I would say it. So fittingness is coolness for my undergraduates, right? It's cool, it's fitting. So the question is, it is cool that God would have created through his creatures. Now, the reason why this is the case according to Aquinas is that only God, properly so-called, can give creatures causality. Now, the analogy I give is this. It is easy, well, not easy actually, but it is doable if you decided you wanted to write a book. But you can't make a book write itself. You can't give a book the ability, the causality to be book. Okay? So he will say that you and I can make stuff. For us to make stuff that can make itself. And so he said, since God properly will do things in the way God does the things that he does, it is fitting that he would have created in a way that he shares the dignity of his being as cause to secondary causes that also are authentic causes. So Aquinas would say it's not surprising that he would evolve and contingency and serendipity. Again, the idea that you can design with serendipity is so unintelligible to us. Like we could never design through serendipity, but God can. So it's fitting that he would do that. So that's a theological response to that question that you posed. And again, it's nothing that I have. It's all from the brilliance of my brother, the angelic God. Yes?
I wanted to follow up James' question. I'm possibly just not understanding the full ramifications of what has become disorder in the world. But if you don't have sin changing the world, how do you come up with a solution to Augustine's problem of natural between? So while it seems clear to you that evil is killing is the word way, what do you do with courage? Where those what are the words of courage or order?
Oh, absolutely, and no, I have not thought about that. Aquinas has certain solution. He will say certain things to the effect that in the state of original justice. So, for example, how different? So I'm going to switch the question to a question that Aquinas would have himself addressed. So when what is the relationship between the animals to Adam? Right. So Adam goes and names all the animals, right? According to Genesis. And so he will talk about the order of nature in such a way that, in a sense, all animals are tame. So he will talk about how human beings have mastery over the animals, which is proper because the higher has mastery over the lower in an ordered universe. And so what part of the disorder is that they go wild. Now, what that means in light of modern biology, I have to sit there and think about it. Now, earthquakes, right? Now, as you heard, plate tectonics are an integral. If we had no plate tectonics, the planet would not be the way that it is. And so, what you have about earthquakes. Now, I don't know, but knowing Aquinas, like, he would say something to the effect of, there were infused knowledge given to Adam, so Adam would understand nature in such a way that he would be able to live in accordance with nature. He knows so much that he would know there's going to be an earthquake coming. All the knowledge that we want, all the knowledge that the geologists are trying to figure out, all of the sensors that are all these volcanoes, through infused knowledge, Adam would have. This is part of the gifts that Adam had in the pre-natural state, and then he would be able to say, oh, there's an earthquake coming, so I'm just going to avoid it, so I'm not going to use it. So, and now, of course, some of these questions can appear, the responses can appear whimsical. And so there has to be further thought on this. And no, I have not thought about this. I've been, the last 7 years I've been basically trying to establish a research laboratory. And I was telling my brother, I got tenure last year as a biology professor. And once you get tenure, for those of you who are professors, you can start doing other things. So what ended up happening is I got tenure, and then I now can go back and read stuff that I haven't been able to read for 7 years because I've so been busy basically running a lab and running a dead society.
Very good.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Father, can you tell us what the limits of biology can teach us? In other words, are there things that we really need to understand, but we'll never understand biology? The question was, are there lessons that the limits of biology can teach us? You know, to teach us as human beings. In other words, we cannot turn to biology, I would assume, and answer everything that we need to know about ourselves as human beings. Those ways in which biology is limited might point to the need for other sources of knowledge about ourselves.
St. Thomas Aquinas will talk about what he calls subalternate sciences. So he will say that there are fields of knowledge that presuppose other fields of knowledge. So he'll say that music presupposes math. And you notice in that particular view of knowledge, you have a multi-tiered account of reality. So I'm going to propose to you that I'm going to go to February 14th, Valentine's Day. Now, biology can provide an account for Valentine's Day. It can deal with things like kin selection, mate choice. Now, the question is, does that exhaust Valentine's Day? Now, if you're a college professor, you will say, no way. Okay? It does not. Now, it can help you understand. So mate choice and the understanding of how males have stuff and females like males who have stuff. And that's why it's not surprising that males have large cars. And so there are explanations for pickup lines, right? So there are ways that so biologists can talk about that is a pickup line that just won't work. That's a pickup line that actually is rooted in radically primitive urges and inclinations associated with the female, so if you do it that way, but you notice that's one explanation. Now, is that the real explanation? Well, it depends on the question you're asking. And so I think that biology can provide questions about the human being that are biological questions. But there are certain questions, especially about the human being qua person, that I think biology just fails. First of all, I think with Professor Bruce, I just don't think biology will ask those questions, number one. And if they did, they're moving out of their field of expertise and pose biological answers to some questions in the categories. It just doesn't make any sense. Yes?
You spoke about the fact that, you took your last slide where you had a single moment of time after Proga, that basically a person, Adam, was given his gift, shared with his wife, explaining kind of the Adam Eve. Is it that moment the idea of soul came into? Do you see,
yes,
the question of soul is at that point?
Again, I'm presupposing a philosophical anthropology within the Catholic tradition, and also within not just the theological tradition, but a philosophical tradition that acknowledges and affirms that there are certain powers of the intellect that are immaterial. And this is another debate, okay? But I'm just going to presuppose that. So to say that something is a human being in the tradition that I'm coming from, with the presuppositions that I've given you, is to say that it's an ensouled human being. So, and a human being equals ensouled body.
And hence, soul is one of those gifts. You had infused knowledge.
Actually, so yes, your soul in a sense is a gift because everything is a gift, but it is also a sense that when He created us as humans, the way He created us is to infuse souls into apt matter. Now, one of the things is that you notice I'm very careful with how I talk about apt matter because people will say, "Well," and I've had questions. Is it just the babies? Is it the adults? Is it the babies and the adults? And I'm going, well, and you know what? And I say, that's one of the things I'm going to ask the Lord when I see Him face to face. I just don't think there's enough data. I just don't think there's enough data. And you can, you can propose solutions based on fittingness. You can say it would be more fitting that He would ensoul X in this scenario versus ensouling Y. And theologians use fittingness and aptness often to talk about things where, in a sense, the data is underdetermined. But for me, when you get to that point, we don't really know. I can propose a solution, and the solution I propose is just to suggest to you that faith and reason are not necessarily opposed. See, so my goal is not to convince you of this answer or that answer. It's to suggest to you that just because science is the way it is doesn't necessarily mean you have to jettison your faith. That it takes work, it takes prayer and fasting first. And then you have to sit down and work it out. And you might not work it out this side of death. Then that makes it more exciting, but then you get to talk to the Lord face to face and you ask Him something. Yes, Father.
What do you think of the Archaic?
Oh, it's interesting. One of my brothers, Father Portia, has been reading Theological the last month and a half. So I've been over the dinner table. We've had Theological this, maybe one that, Neosphere this, New Sphere. I've read bits of him. I've not read everything, so I read him. I know there's truth there. I just don't know where it is because I haven't read it. But I'm gonna go in and read it, try to figure out how. One of the things is he struggled mightily from the very few essays that I read and the excerpts while I was in the seminary. He struggled mightily to bring together faith and reason. And he had what he had, David was, and we have what we have today. And so it's very hard sometimes it's very easy to say that what he did is obviously wrong or obviously misled, but that's because we know more now about even just the biology than we knew back then. He died before 50, and DNA had just been discovered. So from what I've read, some of the evolutionary parts are interesting. Some of the Christological parts, I'm not. Again, it's interesting, veering on weird. And so I had to, in charity, read him more and think about him more to just actually see how he sees Christ's role. Christ, everything was created in and through him, but how it is that he does this, how he is the beginning and the end, not just of you and me, but for everything. I think I would, like I said, now I have the time, God willing, the opportunity to think about that a little bit more. Yes, sir.
What do you think of Dr. Densky's presentation?
Unfortunately, I had to attend the ordination. So yesterday was the priestly ordinations for the Diocese of Providence, and a former student was ordained to the Holy Priesthood. So I had to attend his ordination, so I wasn't able to. I read ID, right? And what's striking is, my response to people talking about ID is, if you don't have metaphysics, right, and and you're trying to put purpose and design together, then IDE is one of the ways that you could possibly do it. The problem is that there are many problems that I find with IDE, not just theologically and philosophically, but biologically as well. I find that the proposals have been fascinating, especially Michael Behe's I struggle with that only because, as Professor Bruce pointed out, intelligent design presupposes a miraculous event. And that if a certain machine, like the bacterial flagella, was not able to be assembled in a naturalistic way, guided by God. And you see, it's again, I'm always going to qualify that, right? That anything that can move, anything that happens, because God gives it existence, is necessarily under His providence and His governance. I give you an example. So irreducible complexity is a proposal. I don't know if you talked about that yesterday, but there are certain structures in nature that, as a whole, cannot be, in a sense, assembled in a piecemeal fashion. And so, with like bacterial flagella is one of them. I'm presupposing that the very act of existing is something that can only be given by God, who, if you ask who He is, as He said in the 3rd chapter of Exodus, He is who He is. You know, He is self-existing existence. And so the fact that you don't disappear means that He is here by the power of His, by virtue of His power, and that He is sustaining your existence. So the thing with ID is that irreducible complexity. What happens now is if you look, for example, and I've written about this, if you look at an example for the molecular mechanism whereby the HIV virus latches onto a human cell, and so there are multiple molecules that come together in order for that event to take place. There's a proposal that that mechanism could be irreducibly complex. I mean, there's multiple parts that come together, and they will not work unless they function together. But if this is the case, it becomes interesting because half of the parts are human, they're found in human origin, in the human genome. The other half are viral. So now you have to ask, and as I pointed out to you, the most recent data suggests that we evolved 50 to 100,000 years ago. But the data suggests too that HIV evolved and appeared on the scene 1939 plus or minus 10 years. So now you have an irreducibly complex molecular system where the genes for one half were in place thousands of years before the genes for the other half appeared. Well, if that's the case, and you see you open up the possibility for genes showing up at different points, they're still, quote, irreducible. And I find there's no need to go there.
What about the ingredients?
What about the ingredients?
Let's stop there.